And we are back on Take Action News. This is Richard Eskow. And, I was talking in the monologue just a minute ago about the social contract. And one of the things that really disturbs me and concerns me is when the profit motive begins to interfere with the social contract, as it's begun to do in education. And for more on that, I want to turn to our next guest. Jeff Bryant is the executive director of the Education Opportunity Network, which, among other things, makes for a neat acronym, EON. Jeff works with me at the Campaign for America's Future, where I am a senior fellow, and I believe Jeff is also. And we also both write for Salon from time to time. And I like to think that Jeff is also a friend. I certainly have the highest regard for his work. Jeff, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me on, Richard.
Well, listen, I wanted to talk to you, as I mentioned, you do a lot of great work in the education area, but I wanted to talk to you specifically about the profit motive and what it might do. We've heard a lot in the last few years about how the so-called, quote-unquote, radicals and revolutionaries and reformers, are the Michelle Rhees of the world, the people who are pushing for privatized education and charter schools and all this. But you did a very interesting piece for Salon on the problems with charter schools, and the headline that they gave it was, and I know as a fellow writer for Salon, we don't write our own headlines necessarily, but the truth about charter schools: padded cells, corruption, lousy instruction, and worse results. Your point, I think, was that while some charter schools do excellent work, there's a lot of problem there. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, Richard. I think that right off the bat, I want to make it clear that not all charter schools can be painted with the same brush. And if you're a parent out there who really likes your charter school, well, more power to you. That's good. But I don't think we should overlook what's happening with charter schools in this country. Charter schools were originally conceived by the head of a teachers union, Al Shanker of the American Federation of Teachers, as an idea for a community-based organization to be created by parents and educators working together to try out different things, to see what would help students that are having a hard time in school. But things have changed over the years, and now what we have seeing overtaking this idea of charter schools are what I call a charter school industry. About half of the charter schools in America are now run by what's called education management organizations. These are big corporate-like groups. Some of them are for-profit, some of them are non-for-profit. But together, these groups educate over 1 million students. And what they do is they, through their charter, have a means to run schools in a way that would defy traditional public schooling. They get permission to evade all kinds of restrictions and regulations, and they have set up huge lobbying groups to press their interest in state capitals and in Washington, D.C. So the whole notion of charter schools has changed incredibly over the years.
All right, and I think that's legitimate. Al Shanker, those of us who, I was a kid when he was on the rise in New Jersey, was a colorful character, to say the least. But your point is well taken, that what was originally almost a sort of individual experimental approach to education, in some cases, and there are good charter schools, but some cases it's become a corporate initiative. So how does that go wrong when it does go wrong? And again, I appreciate your responsibility and your attitude in emphasizing that some charter schools do a good job. But when it does go wrong, what goes wrong?
Well, first of all, charter schools, if you look at the empirical data, don't do any better than traditional public schools, and oftentimes do worse. But what they often do is they try to game the system by selecting what kind of students they will enroll. For instance, a new charter school being started where I live, I happen to be based in North Carolina, was created by a land developer who has a gated community. It's a very affluent community, way more affluent than the surrounding area. And so this charter school is going to start, and of course it will tout its great academic prowess, but the thing is that charter doesn't enroll the same kind of students as the entire community enrolls.
Well, And let me jump in for a second, too. That charter school, I can't speak, in this specific instance, is getting a public school funding as well?
Yes.
State funding?
Yeah, charter schools, it varies from state to state what portion they get. In Arizona, for instance, charter schools get twice what a normal public school gets to educate a student. But that varies from state to state. And in many states, a charter school may only get half of what a normal school gets to educate a student. But charters also are oftentimes connected with big foundations. One of the most famous charter schools, for instance, is run by Jeffrey Canada in New York City. His school has gotten great accolades for doing wonderful things to educate poor children. But the fact of the matter is he's capable of spending way more on a student than normal schools do, because 2/3 of his money comes from foundations linked to Wall Street, including Goldman Sachs. So charter schools can game the system because they can fly above regulations. They can game the system to decide what kind of school students they want to enroll. And they can also go through various shenanigans to try to boost their test scores and make themselves look better. So what happens is they become a competitive school system. And since they do get money from public funds, from taxpayers that's been designated for education, they end up competing with local schools and taking money out of the system and harming the local schools that have to take whoever walks through the door.
Well, and there's another dimension to this too, Jeff. We're talking with Jeff Bryant, who is the director of the Education Opportunity Network. There's another dimension to it too, which is I have no problem, and presumably you have no problem, if somebody in a gated community wants to start a school for the kids growing up there, that's their business. But when they're taking state funds to do it, again, I go back to the idea of the social contract. We're all in this together, supposedly. But if we have state funds going for a school that is de facto, whether they want it to be or not, segregated into students of the types of families that can live there, I just wonder if that isn't somehow corroding the community and the social contract that binds us all together.
Another highly visible sign of the erosion of the social contract that charter schools contribute to is the fact that wherever you see a proliferation of charter schools, you see lots of segregation on the basis of race and income. Charter schools far and away are more segregated than traditional public schools. And so, in effect, charters have been linked to Jim Crow days, when the idea of a charter school was actually picked up by towns in the South in order to pull white kids out of the public schools that were being desegregated and send them to a place where they would be only with white kids, but they would still get taxpayer money to do that. Now, I'm not saying
Jeff, I heard you mention that the other day at a meeting, and I wanted to ask you about that because I thought that Brown versus Board of Education made that illegal.
It's illegal if it's enforced. Schools are now more racially segregated than they were 40 years ago.
So isn't that a breakdown of our agreement to build a society where everyone is equal and equality is linked to the ability to not be separated into separate groups? Yes,
absolutely. And you see that played out not only in public policy, but in budget policy, where in many states, schools that need the money the most because they educate more poor kids, and poor kids do cost more money to educate than wealthier children, those schools are getting the least amount of money, sometimes 50, 60% less. And that's intentional. That's a policy that's created and signed off on by our leadership.
So what you're describing, I mean, when you strip away even the political outrage that we can sometimes feel at these things, is an enormously sad situation to me. I mean, my initial response is sadness, great sadness, because the most beautiful resource this country has is its children. And the notion that we are, in effect, discarding the futures and the abilities and the promise which these millions of children possess because of where they were born and the socioeconomic segment that their families occupied, to me is a tragic situation. And I guess my question for you would be, is there anything people who feel the same way can do about it?
I think, first of all, we have to penetrate the rhetoric out there and expose it for what it is. Right now, charter schools in particular, and indeed the whole school reform movement, that is, as it's being called, is being sold to the American people as a civil rights movement, that this is something done for the benefit of poor kids to get them out of quote-unquote failed schools. But the people leading this movement hardly ever send their kids to these charter schools. And they don't, and they often don't even send their kids to public schools. Now, I'm not criticizing anybody for where you send your kids to school. That's your own business. But nevertheless, it seems to be a policy of how do we educate those other kids, those kids that are in poor communities, that don't do well on tests, that oftentimes have higher
Jeff, I'm sorry to cut you off, but we're going to have to leave it there. We're coming up on a hard stop. Where can, in 10 seconds, where can people go to get more information on what you do? In 5 seconds.
EducationOpportunitynetwork.org. Sign up for my weekly newsletter.
Jeff, thanks so much. We'll be right back on Take Action News. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.